everybody. So today we're going to talk about autofocus systems. And pretty much every modern camera made today has at least 3 modes of autofocus, and typically even more. You have AFS, AFC, AFAI, or AF wide. So typically the AFS is single autofocus. So that's designed for a single point. You're shooting a still object. AFC is continuous autofocus. So the lens will try and track an object as it moves, or maybe doesn't move, maybe you're moving, and try to micro adjust for that. The AF wide takes in more of the scene and tries to computationally correct the autofocus. It's also the almost fully autofocus consideration. Now, in cameras over the last couple of years, we've added some additional autofocus options, which is face detection. Some camera manufacturers have taken that a step further and added eye detection, pet detection, animal detection. Some even include types of object detection for things like if you're sports shooting and you're shooting car races or motorcycle races, things of that nature. So those are at the basic level, the autofocus options that you have. I typically always shoot in AFS. I just like knowing that a particular point is in focus and I'm choosing that point intentionally. Now, the newer cameras with the eye autofocus makes a huge, strong case for using that focus, particularly if you're like a wedding shooter or portrait shooter. You know, it's all about getting the eyes correctly focused. A poorly focused image ruins way more photos than any other mistake you can make on a photo. Now, autofocus systems have evolved over time. So it used to be, it started out with contrast autofocus systems. Contrast autofocus system usually looks for the brightest and the darkest lines and tries to make a decision based on the contrast between those elements. The phase system, I am actually not so much aware of how well that works. Generally, that's the phase detection system. Apparently, is almost used exclusively for tracking motion. And it is normally done in DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. It's very fast, and it's a highly prevalent focusing system in DSLRs and early mirrorless cameras. The contrast detection autofocus is heavily used in mirrorless cameras and cameras that have live view modes. And as I previously said, that focusing method is best for static objects. Then there's hybrid autofocus, which obviously combines both of those methodologies and is supposed to be fast and highly accurate. And that is a true statement. So you know, AFS, again, that is typically the still object shooting. The AFC autofocus is for moving subjects. Then you have AFI or AFA hybrid mode, which actually tries to detect the motion. Um, so, in addition to that, there are some other options when it comes to focusing. Those options include zone autofocusing, which zone autofocusing is actually good for moderate movement subjects. Then you have wide area or wide auto area autofocus. The camera chooses the focus point, and this works best when your subject is a person. This is not a common autofocus that is used. I actually personally don't even really think they should have even bothered with this. I personally would not use the wide or the auto area autofocus. Um, the eye autofocus and face detect system, that's a different conversation. Um, those are basically on almost all the modern mirrorless cameras. You won't typically see those in DSLRs, um, except for some of the very last models that came out. Um, Potentially like the Nikon D850. Um, so um, the eye autofocus system will lock onto your eyes. They can lock onto most animal eyes, including bird eyes, in most systems, not all systems, not yet anyway. Um, and that eye autofocus has actually really generated improvements in wildlife photography. Um, so if you're a wildlife shooter, yeah, you want to get a camera that's got good eye autofocus. That's probably your best bet. Now, me more as a general shooter, um, oddly, unless I'm shooting the Hasselblad on my Leicas, I have to manually focus. Um, on my Fuji, as I said, I just have it on the single point autofocus. Um, you know, it's accurate. It's not the fastest on the XH1, um, but it does its job. It also depends on what lens I put on it. Also, a note on this: if you are adapting lenses, and this is changing a little bit, but if you're adapting lenses, typically you're going to have to manually focus the lens because there's no way for the motors in the lens to communicate to the camera when you're adapting, a Fuji lens to a Sony body or vice versa. You're, there's just no data exchange there. Now, some of the newer cameras have focus detection systems even when using a manual focus lens. That can be very helpful. That's why you get focus peaking really shines on a camera because you can use a manual focus lens that does not belong to that camera system and still achieve sharp tack focus. So all things can be overcome. Um, so one thing about focus to remember, particularly when it comes to distance, is focus occurs on a flat plane, not a bubble. Um, So, like if you set, and I'm a good example of this, with my vision issues, I do a lot of zone focusing. Um, and what I do is a lot of times most of my shooting is outdoors. So I'm shooting at f8 to f11. Well, you get a big depth of field. And what that means is I have a large area in which the objects will be in sharp focus at a long range. Now, things that are closer to me that are out of the depth of field of focus are going to be softer gradually. Um, so if you want to understand depth of field a little bit better, go back to and watch lesson 4, where we have a discussion on depth of field. Now, one thing about a lot of modern cameras that can be frustrating. So, you know, example on my Fuji, uh, I have it in the other room, is there's 2 ways of achieving your autofocus. One is you have to press the shutter button. And this is common for most people. You have to press the shutter button, you hear the beep or the tone, and then you press and you take your picture. There's also back button focus. Back button focus is great for one particular thing. It prevents accidentally refocusing, because all you do is you use that back button focus. You hold that button down and your focus is locked. So as you press your shutter button and you're moving, your focus stays locked at that same range for every image as long as you're holding down that back focus button. Um, some cameras actually don't have, most cameras don't have a dedicated back focus button, but usually if they have a programmable button, that's one of the first things you should probably program. So anyway, um, you know, going back to the manual focusing for most people is going to be your vintage lenses because they simply don't have focus motors. Um, Sometimes you'll need to manually focus if you're in low light. You're definitely going to have to manual focus if you're trying to do macro photography, because again, the way you do macro photography is you're going to use, usually you put your 50 millimeter lens on or 75 millimeter lens on, and then they look like magnifying glass lenses, but you screw them into the filter holder on your lens, and then you get a really nice close up, usually a focus distance of like 2 to 6 inches from your subject. Um, the alternative to that is macro extension tubes. The extension tubes do effectively cut off communication between the lens and the camera, so you'll have to manually focus the lens to get a sharp image. Um, the other typical areas that you're going to do manual focus is going to be landscape photography. Now, here's a little thing about autofocus lenses and a lot of lenses, particularly cheaper lenses, is most of the time you're going to have your camera set for infinity focus. But some lenses, you'll notice, technically focus past infinity, and that's a problem. Um, and that's really going to screw up a lot of images if you pre-focus and you set it and you just turn your lens all the way till the end. You'll find all of a sudden, for some reason, your lenses are out of focus and you're going, why did this happen? Well, it's because you extended the lens too far. So it's always good and relatively works well is pull back on the focus just a little bit. Because if you're shooting at f8 or f11, your depth of field is wide. So you can pull back the focus a little bit on your lens, still achieve infinity focus, and you'll have a much better image quality as far as sharpness. So, and if you're inside a studio, the nice thing about studio work is your subject is still and you have complete control over your environment. So a lot of people, a lot of professionals prefer to do manual focus because they know once they set it, they're good to go. They can take as many pictures as they want and they know that that picture will be in focus. So other tools, as I previously mentioned, are the focus peaking. Um, Also, most modern cameras also have it where you can magnify your focus for fine tuning your focus. Uh, and then going back to vintage photography, um, most SLR cameras from that age had a split prism, and your image would be split in two, and as you focused, the image would slide and would look correct through the viewfinder, and then you would know that you were in focus. I had Minolta SRT 101 and a Pentax K1000. That's how those worked. You got used to it really fast, and generally you got really good really fast using that technique. But again, that's old film cameras. The one deviation for that is rangefinder cameras. Now, the principle is kind of the same. The difference is it's a patch in the center of the viewfinder, and the patch, and this is based on the fact that there's a second uh, viewport in the camera that is offset, and it captures a bit of light and displays that in the primary viewfinder, and that is different from the lens. And because of the difference, you'll get this square patch, and the subject will appear over here when it's out of focus, and in the patch it'll be here. And as you line up this to match perfectly, then you know you're in focus. Now, problem with rangefinders is they can get out of calibration, and that can be really frustrating. You think you've nailed the focus, and you pull up your pictures on the monitor, and you are slightly out of focus. Unfortunately, your only option with newer rangefinder cameras is to send them back to the manufacturer to be recalibrated. Vintage autofocus, or I'm sorry, vintage rangefinder cameras, um, a lot of people have written guides, particularly the old camera repair guys, some of which are almost as famous as the cameras themselves. Um, they can calibrate it. They have posted guides on how to calibrate it yourself. I would never calibrate a rangefinder myself. Um, but anyway, that's what you would do on old film cameras. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please press the like and subscribe buttons, and have a good week. Christmas is coming up, so I might skip a week. Um, I don't know. Anyway, if I don't see you before Christmas again, have a great holiday, be safe, and thanks for watching.